there's a lot of work that we're doing specifically around, getting the mouse feel to be right. Making sure that we have the right mouse settings. Remappable keys. I think, as you mentioned, there's some other settings in there that we're looking at in terms of one of the biggest pieces of feedback we got is that you need a field of view slider, right? So something that lets you basically tweak what's there from the defaults. And that's an interesting challenge in of itself because, again, a lot of these games, they kind of had a fixed set of settings. So figuring that out and making that work really well on PC. It's being able to support multiple resolutions, variable frame rate. Just basically a lot of those kinds of options, that feed into that pillar. And just making sure that if you played this game, you wouldn't necessarily know that it had started out as a console game. Like it would feel like something that was there as a PC experience from the beginning.
For sure. And I know the blog I mentioned earlier that will come out later, Postum sat down with Scoops and Andrew and did a pretty interesting technical discussion around the challenges, specifically with things like FOV slider, where these games were built with a certain FOV. Generally, back in the day, I think it was a trade-off between design goals and then performance, right? Because the more you're rendering, the more it'll strain the hardware. So that's not so much a problem in the world of PC, where you could scale up to these bleeding-edge machines. But it does mean a lot of the content wasn't authored to necessarily look great when you start to expand that field of view. So I think Tyler even has some screenshots of some of the examples that the team's having to work through right now, like what happens when you crank that all the way up. You'll start to see through your arm and your weapons start to skew. So interesting challenges there to work through, I think, from engineering and just on the content side. Like how do we solve for that? And I think you guys are willing to, if somebody wants to knowingly say, I'm okay with this looking weird, I want to go extreme, maybe that's fine, right?
Yeah, I think we want to give people choices. And I think also this is another area where we're really looking forward to the flighting feedback in particular around how that plays out in the multiplayer space, right? So, again, like you mentioned, the content wasn't necessarily authored for wider FOVs. So as we think about it, how does that impact the way that the levels play and things like that? So there's definitely scenarios where we want to give people the power to do what they want with that and be okay with those results. And then we also have to think about how it impacts the competitive environment as well. So a lot to think about there.
Looks like Mixer Chat's pretty excited so far with your playthrough here, Ferdinand. You're doing a good job.
That's surprising.
I'm glad people think it looks great. I agree. I mean, it's easy for me to say this, but I can't even. It does look good here, but I'm telling you, on a nice monitor that supports HDR, 4K, you would never know this game came out years ago. I think it aged tremendously well, and in fact, I really can't wait for some of my friends that worked on the original Reach to see what their new baby looks like with this fresh coat of paint. Just a testament, I think, to how great the source material was in the first place. Some great art direction here. So as Ferdinand goes through, let me take a look at my notes here and see what else we might want to make sure we get to. We do want to talk about the progression system here in just a minute, Max, but that might be like a little bit of a beefier conversation, so we might hold off on that slightly. Let's see, we talked about our PC pillars. I have seen some questions in the chat already popping up about matchmaking settings, which is covered in the May Update blog, thanks to Dana, otherwise known as the Duck.
Psycho Duck.
Psycho Duck, DuckTales, as his sections now come to be known. But one question we get a lot, Max, is what settings will we look forward to using in matchmaking? And I think we're able to go ahead and put that to bed, right?
Yeah, so I think that we've gotten a good amount of feedback in terms of where people feel the settings should be, and there's kind of the retail settings that came out at launch, and then there was the title update that came out much later in the life cycle, which reduced bloom and had a number of other changes for multiplayer. And we think both from what we've heard externally and internally, we feel the TU settings are the ones to use for matchmaking. And interestingly, I think the thing about all of these settings is that the bigger question is where else would we like to think about them. And I certainly think the competitive space is the one where we want to think about it. And I think there's other questions of does it make sense in the other modes and customs and things like that. So I think we're going to continue to look into feedback from folks about where else they'd like to see it.
Yeah, but I did hear you confirm that we will use the TU settings for all of MCC social matchmaking. and our ranked matchmaking as well. But then we're looking at probably not using those, for example, in some of the other modes of play.
Right.
Correct?
Right.
Okay.
So there's some specific choices, like I believe Invasion, has some specific considerations for the title updates. So
but like you said, once I think flighting will certainly be a great way for us to get more feedback and validate some of these decisions that we've made.